But before those books, there really wasn't much of a story of antagonism between religion and science. And the reason for that was because there actually wasn't one. And these people had to make it up.
Welcome to a podcast about philosophy, science, God, faith, ethics, and much more. And welcome to our first episode in English, since we have a British guest today. I think that we will probably do a few podcasts in English, especially when we're fortunate enough to have esteemed guests such as today. But of course, most of them will still be in Norwegian. Both because, as you can hear, my pronunciation are pretty far from top-notch, and also because there are, of course, several excellent international podcasts for the English audience. Podcasts such as Pints with Aquinas, Unbelievable, The Thomistic Institute, In Our Time, History of Philosophy Without Gaps, and many, many more. And today I brought with me the young Norwegian particle physicist from last time, Anders Kvellestad. My name is danieljoachim. And together we have talked to a British professor of theoretical physics, Tom McLeish, who has done some excellent work in the area of faith and science. And we have talked about what is the relation between faith and science, and is that even a meaningful question? I think that Mr. McLeish has some really fresh and good perspectives on this, as I hope that you will appreciate that, and no matter if you're a Christian or a skeptic. As always, you can give comments, feedback, and also propose some new guests if you just send an email to mail@danieljoachim.org or contact me on Facebook. So, with no further ado, this is me and Anders Kvellestad talking to Tom McLeish. So we wish to welcome Tom McLeish. Tom McLeish is a theoretical physicist. He's a former physics professor at Durham University and currently holds the chair of natural philosophy at the University of York. And he also written a couple of books on the topics of faith and wisdom and science. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm very pleased to join your podcast.
We're very lucky to have you here. And we know that you are broadcasting to us now from the Royal Society.
Yes, I am. Good place for a scientist. This is well, it wasn't in this building now that the society was founded, but of course there is a continuity with the oldest scientific academy in the world, and the Royal Society of, as its full name is, Royal Society of London for the Investigation of Nature, and its original founders. And I'm actually just looking in the room I'm in at a facsimile of the book in which all the fellows sign their names with a quill pen dipped in ink when one's elected. And you know, there's a wonderful thing. The society is still on volume 1. And the sense of sheer inheritance and privilege to sign your name, and then they turn the pages back and there's Isaac Newton's signature. It's overwhelming. It's an overwhelming sense of science and story.
Yeah, I can imagine. And do you still use a quill pen?
Oh yeah, for that one, it's the only time I've ever used a quill pen in my life. It's not very easy, and most of us really struggle, and it's very blotchy. They do try to train us in how to use this thing, but it's difficult.
Yeah, so Tom, in your books, you deal with this question in a very original and creative way, I think, because you try to draw these different paths of science and faith and even art together on the quest for truth, and sort of shows that we are better off by viewing them as deeply human activities that are all directed at the same uncovering of wisdom and the web of reality. Can't you tell us a bit about what you're trying to do in your books?
Yeah, thank you. Well, you clearly read them, so I'm very impressed. That was a masterful summary. So I guess the first thing to say is the best compliment that I had from anyone around the first book, the Faith and Wisdom in Science book, was when they came to me and said, Tom, your book, it's not a science and religion book at all, is it? And I said, no, it's not. Good, you spotted it. My principal goal, my driving force for writing it was as a scientist, and I'm sure many of your scientific listeners will understand what I'm saying. I felt deeply sad and uncomfortable that science isn't just enjoyed by more people at an appropriate level. I mean, a bit like music. Everybody likes a bit of music. We're not necessarily particularly good at it. Some of us are better than others, but we all enjoy listening to it. And I've felt in my gut, really, for a long time that science ought to be a bit like that. But we've put it on a shelf. We put it behind locked laboratory doors, if you like. The way I put it is we don't have a cultural story for what science is. I felt it should be in the same basket of activities as like I said, music, but also writing, storytelling, art. And that's what I wanted to start thinking about. And what sort of surprised me, or perhaps it shouldn't have surprised me, is that in answering that question, and therefore wanting to trace back some of the earliest tributaries, if you like, of the river that's become science, because I'm also convinced that the curiosity, the fundamental ingredients of science are very old, that led me to a completely new way of thinking about theology and wisdom and science.
In the introduction, you use a very interesting analogy towards lack of viewing music only through the field of sonology. Like viewing sonology as only an activity that's highly specialized, that's only accessible to a few highly trained people, but are not possible to enjoy for the population at large.
That's right. In the world where we have done to music, in that world, what we have done to science in this world, no one ever hears a jazz quartet, no one goes to a rock concert, no one hears a symphony orchestra. That's far too difficult. Oh, those things happen, but they happen behind sonology laboratory doors. The experts get to hear that, and if we're lucky, on the radio the next morning, the presenter might whistle the tune to us. But the idea that ordinary people could cope with harmony and counterpoint is ridiculous. And I hated writing this. Horrible world, and I had to stop because it was horrible. But then I realized the reason it was horrible is it's the same horror that I have at a world where everyone thinks that science is for geeky people only, like the people that in the US sitcom The Big Bang Theory that you'd never want to name as your friends, and I thought that was deeply sad. And it's also tied into the fundamental other human motivations. Why do people make art? Why do people tell stories? And why do people seek after God? And so the wisdom literature is where I landed. The ancient tradition of wisdom is where I landed, and I was astonished with what I found there.
That's very interesting. Where do you think we go from here to sort of get back to that, to explore the deep roots of the natural philosophy and also make it accessible?
Yeah. Well, that's right. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that there is a tide turning here. I mean, I think that there are many writers and broadcasters that certainly are in this country who are making a really good job of making science accessible in a more in a sort of playful way, in a contemplative way, in a sort of listening way. But I do think that part of the problem here is the 19th century. The 19th century has a lot to blame for. There are two elements of the 19th century that I think has a lot to blame for. One is the sort of romantic casting of science as the force that desiccates, that sucks all wonder out of the world. You get it in John Keats, who wrote a famous poem called Lamia, where he says, cold philosophy will clip an angel's wings, will unweave the rainbow. That famous sentence that that inspired Richard Dawkins to write his book, Reweaving the Rainbow. So that's the first thing. And Edgar Allan Poe and others talk of desiccating science. And I just don't think they understand it. They've not, of course, other poems, by the way, other poets like Shelley and Wordsworth and Coleridge had quite a different view on science and saw science as a potential inspirer. So that's one of the things that has damaged the cultural view of science. The other is the 19th century manufacture of what we call the conflict myth, the conflict thesis that throughout history, science and religion or theology have been at war with each other. Now, most people will think, or raise that many of your listeners will not find that unproblematic. Well, of course they are. Well, no, actually, not of course they are. This story was invented by two American authors, actually, Draper and White. They both wrote best-selling books with titles like The History of the Warfare Between Science and Christendom towards the end of the 19th century. Very few people have heard of these books now, although they were bestsellers at the time. But before those books, there really wasn't much of a story of antagonism between religion and science. And the reason for that was because there actually wasn't one. And these people had to make it up. And now I think whether one's a believer or not, that story that science tears apart poetry and it tears down everything that motivates to look towards the divine, towards God, is doing science more damage than these other things. That's the point.
And you also draw upon the point of etymology, I think, because the term scientist is only coined in the 19th century.
That's true.
And you explain how the term going from being a natural philosopher, which literally means being a lover of wisdom, with things to do about nature, to sort of just being a scientist, where the etymological roots is to know.
Scary, Latin to know, that's right. And I've sometimes giving a general public talk about science, where I know that a good number of my audience has had difficulty with science. Maybe it was the thing they were told they weren't very good at school. Maybe it's a painful thing to them. Maybe they feel with John Keats that it sucks the poetry and beauty out of nature. I don't know. But I've sometimes said, okay, if science is a problem to you, then try thinking about it in another way. Suppose I said, instead of saying, would you be interested in science, would you be interested in the love of wisdom to do with natural things, which is, as you quite rightly say, the translation of natural philosophy. And I sometimes see smiles. And people think, oh, that's an interesting, that's a more humble approach. It isn't, of course, a knowledge claim. It's more, and it has love in it, and it's just seeking after wisdom. And I think people resonate with that more. And that was you're right, that's the original thing. The story there is that William Whewell, in the face of the fragmentation of science, that's the other thing that happened, of course, in the 19th century. Disciplines as a whole got fragmented, and the scientific disciplines, we had geology and astronomy and zoology and botany, all these things started diversifying. And instead of just in the UK, just having the Royal Society, we got the Royal Society of Chemistry and the Physics and the Geological Society, and everything started falling apart. And that's what motivates. It's a good motivation for Whewell to say, look, we need one name that summarizes what we all do. But in some ways, unfortunately, he'd forgotten that was a perfectly good name, the natural philosopher. So he invented the scientist. Apparently, some people said it sounded, one of its main criticisms is that it sounded too American. It sounded like the sort of thing Americans would do. But actually, it turned out to be exactly right. It caught on in America first in the 19th century. So scientists like Maxwell and Faraday refused to be called scientists. But in the end, the Americans, as they always do, they win the publicity game, and it was re-imported into Europe from our lovely American friends there. But I think, search for wisdom. And then, of course, the idea that science was previously called, if you like, in the last chapter. So I sometimes put it this way. I say that the activity we call science is the name of the current chapter in a book that humanity has been writing for centuries and centuries. The previous chapter was natural philosophy. And then there was that was also the case in the great medieval centuries, which were the sources of much interesting science. It's part of this rewriting of history has been this invention of this nasty term, the Dark Ages. Well, the only thing that's dark about the Dark Ages is our ignorance of them. There were serious scholars in the High Middle Ages, both Islamic and Christian, looking at light and color and sound and all sorts of fascinating things. Then before that, going back to the ancient world, people are used to thinking of ancient Greek science as being perhaps the root of science, Plato, Aristotle, Eratosthenes, Thales. But there's an equally strong root in ancient Semitic thought, Babylonian, Egyptian, and Hebrew. The example that, for my money at least, the most important ancient text to do with our relationship with nature is the book of Job, so-called the book of Job. It's found in the Old Testament. No one quite knows where its source was when it was written, but it is shot through with questioning into the structure of nature in a way that, not just for me as a scientist who reads it, every scientist that I know who I've suggested read the book of Job, in particular some of the more poetic parts of the nature poetic parts of it, are astonished with what they read.
And it's great listening to you, Tom. And about what you said about the natural philosophy, meaning love of wisdom of natural things, it got me thinking of a book I read quite recently about Alexander von Humboldt, this Andrea Wolf's book, The Invention of Nature.
Oh yes, Andrea Wolf's book, yes. Yeah,
exactly. And after reading that and reading your book, I mean, then this Humboldt character really embodies this natural philosopher, this
yes,
love of wisdom of natural things as a contrast to the very hard science words. So that was okay. A slight digression, but I think it's, for me, that the way you pointed out the difference between scientists and natural philosophy, it reflects I can see how that shapes my view of that book. So that's interesting. But about your faith and the faith and wisdom in science book, which I found really, really interesting. One particular thing that I liked, and I would love to hear you discuss it now, is your discussion about the different ways in which people have tried to relate theology and science. Yeah. And you described 3 different ways and your alternative to this. Could you expand on that a bit?
Well, yes, certainly. You see, I know you're a scientist, so you'll know that one of the ways in which we work, one of the most important lessons that a scientist ever learns to be creative in science is to ask the right question.
Exactly.
In fact, Einstein said this. He said, if you give me a problem and give me an hour to solve it, 55 minutes I will spend working out exactly what the right question is. Then the last 5 I'll actually spend solving it. He's so right. And it's, of course, I'm very slow about this, and maybe you as well will have had the experience. The question I'm normally asked of people who know I'm a Christian and a physicist, a theoretical physicist or scientist, will ask, how do you reconcile your science and your faith? And they ask that question. And of course, for many years, I thought that, because they asked the question, it must be a real question that's worth asking. And then I realized, actually, just because someone asks a question doesn't mean it's a real question or a useful question, or the most important question even. People could ask me that little joke question, have you stopped beating your wife yet? Well, what do I say? The question assumes, behind the question are already assumptions that belong to a world that doesn't exist, right? And to this, what I mean about this question, and usually the science faith or the science religion or science theology question is formulated in this, we've got to reconcile this opposition between science and faith. And I realized, of course, for me, my own personal experience is that question doesn't arise. And I tried to work out why it was arising for other people. And I had some thoughts about that, one of which I've already mentioned. I mean, there's actually this alternative truth, this Draper-White hypothesis that the two have always been at each other's throats. It's simply not true. It's those two gentlemen, when history didn't actually come up with evidence to support that thesis, they were perfectly content to invent history. But that's a story which is known in the scholarly world, but it's not really got out into the public or media world. Anyway, so let's think of a better question. And it's a question that also applied itself to my first question, which is about reconstituting science and culture in a healthy way. And the question is, what is science for? It's a question of purpose. Or actually, formulating the question another way, what is science for? Or within a Christian mind, or within a theological mind, the question would be not, can I reconcile science and theology, or theology and science? The question would be, what is the theology of science? So you turn the and to an of. If you like, rather than becoming a tennis game where science and faith are lobbing the ball over a net at each other, it becomes a squash game in which they're both on the same side, dancing around each other in a rather more creative way. So the nice thing, the helpful thing about asking questions theologically is because theology knows how to handle purpose. The reason we do things, the teleology end to which we're moving. And humans have purposes. We invent purpose, but actually academically, it's rather we live in a rather purposeless world. But the theology of science is a story that the wisdom literature I mentioned before gets you going with. So there's a purpose. And so then I started to think, well, that's the question for me. That's my question, is what is science for? If you like, as a gift. In what part of the human, being human, does it appeal for? Where does it take us? So that's how I wanted to reformulate the question from, if you like, how do you reconcile science and theology, to what is a theology of science?
Exactly. And then if I understand you right, then you view like the purpose of science one purpose of science that you find in this, in some way, science becomes a tool for us to grapple with nature, or to what you say, to mend our broken relationship with the physical world. Did I get that right?
Yeah. Does that make sense to you?
So that's actually my question, because to me, in a sense, I'm already on your side of the tennis court, if there was a tennis court, right? So this is a language that speaks to me. But I can imagine a lot of listeners to whom this language of mending a broken relationship sounds very foreign and strange.
Yeah, well, I wonder if it does, though. Let me help them there in that case, because so what do we mean by a broken relationship? What's a broken relationship? Well, there are like 3 stages to a broken relationship. I mean, just by broken relationship, I mean the sort of when our friendships go wrong, or when our love lives go wrong, or when different communities fall out. Or I just mean those ordinary broken relationships. What happens? Well, the first thing to say is that mostly it starts with ignorance. I mean, we've fallen out with our best buddy or with our beloved because we don't actually know each other as well as we thought we did. We should know each other better. We've made assumptions, and we honestly don't know what makes the other person tick. And then from ignorance, there comes an element of fear. That which we don't understand, we also fear a little bit. And finally, the third stage is that which we don't know and which we also fear. The next stage is possible harm. I mean, both ways. So relationships, that's the 3 stages of a broken relationship. And I've always been very interested that Marie Curie she said a lovely thing, the double Nobel Prize winner, 20th century prize. But Marie Curie said the reason we do science is so that we we understand the world and fear it less. And I thought that was wonderful. It also, by the way, resonated beautifully with a lovely passage from a northeastern England saint. Well, in fact, one of my old heroes, called the Venerable Bede. His bones are buried in Durham Cathedral, where I used to work. I used to work at in Durham itself. My walk from one part of the university to another would often take me through the cathedral. And Bede was a great scientist, actually. He wrote a wonderful science book, De Rerum Natura, in the 8th century, early 8th century, late 7th century. And he used to say that the reason, he said in the preface to this book, that the reason we look at the natural world and study it and teach it to our congregations is so that when the lightning strikes or the earth trembles or the storm comes, we shouldn't believe, as the pagans do, you see, that there are demons behind every tree and spirits out to get us. But that no, the one God who made this world in his wisdom, this is how it's made. So we should understand the workings of nature in order that we shouldn't be afraid. So Bede agreed with Marie Curie, and I mean, I'm sure you know it's a common preacher's point, but one that bears the retelling. You know, if I ask you what is the most common commandment in the whole of the Bible, and you know, I'm sure you know that people will guess, well, is it the one about adultery or stealing or murder? No, it's none of those. The most common command is don't be afraid. It's on the lips of every prophet and angel and Jesus himself so many times. It's fascinating that fear is one of the big Bible no-nos. And I do think that's true. So now, can you see, is it very strange to talk about our relation with the natural world as a broken one? It starts off in ignorance. We don't know how it works. We also fear it a bit. It can get us disease, earthquakes, floods, fire, not just ancient peoples, but we have our modern fears about nature as well. Drug-resistant bacteria, plagues, terrifying, global warming. Oh, and global warming, what about the harm? Not only can nature harm us, in this last century, we have learned, like no century before, although interestingly, Humboldt saw this. He was one of the first, of course, people who thought of nature as a system, and he saw valleys desiccated and turned into sand by human over-farming back in the 18th century. So we know, since Humboldt, that we can harm nature too. Well, there you have the three classic ingredients of a broken relationship. So I'm not sure that it's inappropriate language, actually.
No, that sounds, to me, that sounds very reasonable. But it's one of the, I think reading your books is the first time I personally came across thinking about those questions, thinking about the human relationship to science in these questions, in these terms, the terms of a broken relationship. I'd be interested to hear how. So in your book, you focus a lot, especially on the lovely Book of Job, which has now taken on a completely new meaning to me.
Oh, great! Oh, great! My job is done. My work is over.
Absolutely. But how has your reading of Job been received by, say, by theologians?
Good question. Actually, in a more favourable light than I hoped or feared in most cases. So, of course, the answer is it's a mixed reception. It is. I mean, my interpretation of Job is a minority interpretation, but it isn't that minor. I mean, people have spotted this before. So, for your listeners, just to crudely set up the scene here, that Job is the Old Testament version of an often repeated genre of ancient narrative, which is the suffering human being. So, Job is a righteous man, but for whatever reason, well, I give him some reasons we don't need to go into right now, but he's suffering in his view, and indeed ours, unjustly. He loses his family, his property, his wealth, and his health. But for most of the book, he accuses God of being unjust. He demands an answer to this injustice, and his friends, so-called friends, they become less and less friendly as the book goes on, have a rather brittle theology of nature, and they have the not even Sunday school. I mean, the infantile view that if you're a good person, good things will happen to you, and if you're a bad person, bad things happen to you. Although astonishingly, I find that view not uncommon these days too. In spite,
it's a bit like the idea of karma, isn't it?
well, I suppose a bit like karma. That's true, of course, that's. The cycle for karma is a little bit longer. I mean, I think we're talking about almost immediate gratification but you're quite right. And anyway, so eventually God answers Job with this wonderful, wonderful nature poem called The Lord's Answer. And immediately this podcast is over, your listeners should go to their nearest Bible and read those 4 chapters, Job chapter 38 to 42. And I dare anyone not to be moved by the sheer beauty of this nature poem. And they're all questions into nature. Do you know why the Pleiades are bound together and the stars of Orion cast apart? Do you know where light comes from, where hail comes from? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Do you know how the eagle navigates to the south? And they're all questions about the wild and chaotic side of nature. Now, I'll come straight to the point. The standard interpretation of this text is that God is asking Job loads of questions that he can't begin to answer in order to humiliate and to silence him. And that's the only job, that's the only task God has in this case. He wants to shut Job up. Do you know where the hail comes from? Were you there at the foundations of the world? Nope. Well, you don't know much, do you? Why don't you just shut up? But for me, it just doesn't do justice to the text. Now, I have a number of arguments to why this is, and I'm not alone. They've been made by proper theologians as well. But in particular, one of the things I think I was very resonant to is that the argument, this answer of God's doesn't even satisfy Job, because after all, his is a moral complaint. And God then asks him loads of dumbfool questions about ice and snow and wind and hail and eagles. Well, actually, if you go back over Job's earlier arguments and railings and disputations with his friends, you will find that the nature poetry is woven through the whole of the book. In fact, there isn't a single tree or mountain or river or animal in the Lord's answer that hasn't already been mentioned somewhere in the text. So the whole of the book of Job is really this discussion of the balance between order and chaos. Why is nature wild? And our ignorance and fear of this wildness. And like all Jewish questions, I mean, this is the other thing. I mean, there's a lot of cultural misunderstanding. You don't, in the Jewish world, Hebrew world, ancient or modern, you don't ask a question to make someone feel stupid. You ask a question to teach them something. Jewish questions are pedagogical. They're always teaching. So I think I have, honestly, the theology of history on my side here. So God wants to teach Job something. And of course, the best questions are those questions that a teacher asks his or her pupil in ways that a pupil can grow up and answer them himself or herself. And I also noticed that a good number of these questions that God asked Job, we now do know the answer to. We know why the Pleiades are close together and the stars of Orion are cast asunder. It's because the Pleiades have, in astronomical time, quite recently condensed out of the same nebula, and they have not been torn apart yet by the tidal forces of galactic rotation. Oh my goodness. Now, it did take a few thousand years to answer that question, but hey, these texts are kind of timeless texts. So this invitational questioning poem of nature, you see, is, I think, right there at the heart. And it becomes not only the heart of our curiosity to do with our relationship with nature, but it also helps us to become reconciled to nature, because it sets us on the road from ignorance to understanding.
I noticed even one person proposing to rename your book to the peer-reviewed trials of Job.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, we've all been there. All those of us who've had peer-reviewed trials. Yes, yeah.
Oh well, thanks. That's a lovely summary.
I suppose for you, Anders, I had a question for you. So you're a particle physicist.
Yes.
Now, I suppose you must get the answer. Now, I don't get this question quite so much because I work in soft matter physics. I've worked with industry all my life. I've worked with the polymer industry. That some of the theories that we had a long time ago are now in industrial software for plastics design. I'm working with biology. So I have an easy time asking the question, why should we fund you to do your science? Because I can say, well, look, we're making money out of it. We're helping to heal disease with the biologists. You're kind of messing around with supersymmetry and quarks. And what's that? So what do you say when people ask, what's the good of that?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, as many particle physicists, I think we almost tend to take some sort of strange pride in the fact that what we do is utterly useless from the point of view of practical applications. But that means that we really need to focus on the fascination, right? The value of knowledge for knowledge sake, right? And this is another interesting thing that I started thinking about reading your book is the fact that where can you find a source for this? Why should knowledge in itself have some kind of source? And of course, if you start thinking about science in this broader perspective that you draw up in your book, then you actually find that this wisdom is actually is in a sense fundamentally valuable. But anyway, this is independent of this theological perspective. This is really we have to appeal to the pure fascination.
Yeah, there is a fascination, but I actually think that. Francis Bacon, the great philosopher of early modern science, took it beyond fascination. I mean, this is a counter narrative to a common myth. Common myth is that early modern science or Enlightenment science is a kind of final secular throwing of light on a theologically darkened Middle Ages. Sorry guys, it wasn't like that at all. The founders of the Royal Society, where I now sit, like Christopher Wren and Halley and Boyle, they had explicit Christian theological reasons for developing experimental science and experimental method, and it was not exclusively formulated, but largely formulated by Bacon, and it goes something like this: that God made us originally to share with him, with the Creator, this deep knowledge and understanding of creation. So we'd be at peace with it. We'd know how it all worked. We'd know where everything comes from. But that knowledge was one of the original attributes we lost when we disobeyed, and this thing called the fall. Adam and Eve's symbolic, whatever you want to take it, but disobedience of God. We lost that. But that in grace, God gives us our senses and our minds, and if we work very hard, we can strive and gain some of that knowledge back. In fact, it turns out that Bacon didn't invent this way of thinking about the Bible and the relationship between us and creation. This comes from the medieval centuries. Augustine has it, and Aquinas has it, and Robert Grosseteste, who I'm fascinated with, says the same thing. It's a story of being. So this idea of being reconciled to nature is not something that we just want to do. It's something that actually God calls us to do, and that's right at the heart. It's at the motivational heart of science.
Absolutely, and it's and I have to say, for me personally, I mean, I grew up like I guess most people, believing in the conflict thesis, and kind of I knew quite early on that science interested me. I wanted to be a scientist, and I had this cultural sense of there will probably be a conflict here with my Christian belief. So when I actually realized that this conflict thesis is a modern myth, that it was an important turning point for my personal belief, right? Because it made it easier for me to feel a sense of pride and a sense of connection, a sense of historical narrative to the fact that I regard myself as a Christian believer and I do science. Did you always know that this conflict thesis was a myth, or is it something you learned at a later?
Well, I always felt it had to be, because if it were true, the point is, if it were true, if say Christian faith and science were fundamentally in conflict with each other as epistemological or ontological frameworks, then people like you and me would be walking around with the most psychologically damaged split personalities out there. Well, okay, I mean, you're obviously just a cool guy. I mean, I can't speak for myself, but I mean, I'd have felt it. And my atheist friends still accuse me of cognitive dissonance. And I was, well, yeah, just talk for yourselves. I mean, come on, guys. Don't accuse me of something that I'm not either demonstrating or feeling. And because it was later that my inner suspicion that this had to be wrong was filled out with a proper understanding of the history, and realizing that, that many of the myths, the church used to teach the earth was flat. Well, no one ever thought the earth was flat. Bizarre, there's something weird about the 20th century, though, isn't it weird? In a sense, the most unscientific age ever is the age we are currently living in. Paradoxically, no one in history, apart from one or two very unusual who knew they were extreme and balmy people, ever thought the earth was flat. No one seriously thought it was flat. This is the first time in history there's ever been online internet communities who think the earth is flat. No one thought before our friends Draper and White that the church and science were fundamentally in conflict. Oh, and by the way, before someone thinks, what about Galileo? As Peter Harrison has helpfully pointed out, look, everybody in the Galileo affair, everybody from beginning to end was a Christian, number one. Second, of course, the church did a terrible thing. I mean, the church has done, like all power structures have done, awful things in the past, and prevented Galileo from teaching the heliocentric system. But the whole particular story is much more interesting than the Draper and White conflict thesis. Galileo and Cardinal Bellarmine, who became Pope VIII, were best buddies. This is the most scientifically, passionately interested Pope that ever was. Galileo was, of course, a self-opinionated with the most giant ego. I mean, he never gave Kepler an iota of the credit that Kepler should have had, for example. It wasn't a very nice piece of work. So look, it's a tortuous tale, which is fascinating and a really grim story. But one thing it is not is a story of science versus religion. So you're right that it's only later in life that I've read the proper sources and realised that there's been a bit of make-believe going on here. That resonated my own current experience of sort of harmony, but that also how quite apart from that, much more positively, my Christian faith gives me understanding of what science does at the human level, why we're gifted it, what it's for, and therefore what my choices should be around it.
That sounds like a familiar experience, really. So I'm moving on to my my more speculative questions, and it's.
Oh, I see. It's nice that the other ones weren't speculative. They were the dull ones. Okay, great. Go for it.
So this is more in the physics direction. I mean, your project of drawing up this sketching a theology of science, and it's all about the human relationship with science.
It's the intermediary between our relationship with nature. Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. And my question is this: have you considered or drawing in the human relationship to natural laws, to scientific laws? I mean, what I'm specifically aiming at is in physics there are big discussions concerning what's the role of the observer or the agent in fields like quantum physics. The observer plays a crucial role in the formulation of Einstein's theories. Is there do you see possible connections there, or is this just speculation?
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. So are you saying, having theologically formulated science as the toolkit that negotiates the healing of our relationship with nature, are you saying, is there a way in which the particular relation of observer to observed in quantum mechanics plays into or plays out of that?
Exactly. Yes.
Oh, that's a really interesting thought. Well, the answer is I have a little, but I don't think I have anything particularly intelligent to say about it. It's obviously consonant that we are in some ways so deeply entangled with nature. But in a sense, it's been clear that we are entangled with nature in all sorts of ways. We are physical. We're made of natural objects. We are little bits of the universe come alive, able to think about itself and reflect on the universe and make decisions. That is a wonderful thing. Evolution has taught us that we are connected deeply with the entire web of life. I mean, I think it's somehow wonderful that science can help us look at a mushroom as a distant cousin. I know that sounds weird, but I like the fact that mushrooms, never mind fish or dogs, mushrooms, even the bacteria, we all have common ancestors with every other living thing. And we share the basic biochemistry with everything. All our proteins are left-handed, I never get it, all the DNA is all right-handed. I'm not quite sure which way around that is. But we share this one thing with life. And then, of course, we also share this extraordinary balance. And again, I don't think anyone really knows the significance with which to endow or to think about the well-tunedness of the universe. The fact that the matter-antimatter balance is exactly right. The fine structure constant, the gravitational constant, the flatness of the universe is just. We can't imagine a structured universe with us in it, with any other. Of the values for these arbitrary numbers. Martin Rees, former president of the Royal Society, has written a book just about that a few years ago. So there are lots of ways in which we're connected with the world, and I think science helps us to do that. This extraordinary observational way is I think still, for me, a complete mystery. But hey, look, Anders, perhaps you should write the theology of quantum mechanics. I don't know that anyone's really done that. I think there have been a couple of attempts, but they're pretty limp. You should probably do it.
Sounds like something I should do after getting a permanent research position.
Oh, yeah. Well, good luck with that one. Yes. Well, gosh, we could talk about that. My goodness. Oh, and yeah, and all these families. So, I mean, the standard model makes me giggle. It makes me giggle for a number of ways. It makes me laugh out loud from its, of course, beauty and structure. One of the reasons it makes me laugh out loud, of course, is that now here I'm going to get a dig in from the sludgy soft matter physicists against you guys. So everyone else here, Anders and I are going to share a joke here, and he knows. We should explain to listeners that, of course, as in all things, physics has a hierarchy. And Anders here is at the very Mount Olympus of physics. The particle physicists are the gods of the physics world. We know that. Those of us who do, materials physics, we're actually quite a long way below cloud level. We're probably in the swamp in the valley below. Or are we? You see, Anderson and his colleagues have hijacked the word fundamental to the physics they do. They call themselves fundamental physicists. I say all physics is fundamental. That's what makes it physics. And to just drive my argument home, I'd like to ask him how many undetermined parameters there are in the standard model.
Exactly, and okay, depending on counting, you end up around 20, right? But you're
okay. How many free ordinary fixing parameters are there in the fundamental model of entangled polymer dynamics? Answer: I'll tell you, 2.
And then to worsen this, I'm doing supersymmetry, so we're looking at adding 100 more free parameters. But
good luck with that. You
actually make a very good point, and I'm deliberately avoiding using the term fundamental physics about my own research for this, because I agree with you on this topic that there is nothing intrinsically fundamental just because you're looking at a smaller length scale. That's confusing two topics.
I convinced him of this a couple of years ago, so I take full credit for that.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, of course, we could talk about emergence, couldn't we, and reductionism, which kind of maybe that's for next time. But that opens up that debate. You know, are all the causal agents in the world at one particular length scale, or are there causal agents spread throughout K space, if you like, or real length scale space?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great topic and potentially a second podcast. I don't know.
Possibly. I see that the clock is closing in to 1 hour, so we'll respect your time.
Is that okay? I promised someone I'd go and help them with in a meeting of something else. So is that, if that's all right, that would be lovely.
So in the end, I'll just want to thank you so much for guesting our podcast.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for the conversation, Daniel and Anders. So I found that very stimulating indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.